Hi everyone, welcome. This is a GRE question review video. My name is Juliet Anderson. I have recently completed the GRE. I spent a number of hours studying for it, accessing resources for it, and committed a greater part of 2020 to it. And so I thought this would be a good opportunity that instead of just studying for it, taking the test and having all of that knowledge land there and end there, that instead I would make a few quick videos on some of my lessons learned, ways that I approach things. So by no means am I a tutor or a professional that does this during the day, maybe for work, but rather I have just gotten some really valuable lessons learned and wanted to pass it on. So I'm going to flip to the next slide. All right, so goals and objectives. So like I mentioned, this is just a knowledge share opportunity. I'm going to explain some of the strategies in which I used to answer the questions that I've picked out. I am going to be focusing on quantitative reasoning review. If you have questions about the verbal, there's a number of books and resources as well in the resources that I list. But for the sake of this video, we're going to focus on quantitative reasoning. Specifically on 4 practice test questions. I would recommend, if you have not yet completed the ETS practice test, that you pause the video here. It's really valuable to be taking those tests without any previous knowledge of the content on them. It helps you gauge how you're doing, how you're going to do, where you need to focus. So you're welcome to continue watching this video, but I would recommend completing those practice tests first. And that way you have a strong grasp on where you currently stand. But otherwise, we're going to go ahead and dive in. So I wanted to kick it off with a couple of resources. ETS is what you'll use to take your test. They're going to have a ton of prep resources. That's where these practice questions have come from. The Khan Academy is wildly useful. I used it a lot when reviewing some of the quantitative reasoning that maybe was a little more rusty at the beginning. I've been out of school for a number of years, so some of the information was quite the refresher for me, as I'm sure it is for others as well. And then Kaplan and Princeton Review are 2 other resources for tutorials and explanations and strategy for the test, knowing that it is timed and there are certain things that you can do to set yourself up for success. So if you haven't utilized these resources yet, I would strongly recommend it. All right, so we're going to go ahead and get started with this question. This format is very common. I would recommend getting familiar with this. So essentially what they will do on the test is they'll pose a question, give a quantity and a second quantity, and then ask whether one is greater than the other, whether they're equal, or maybe there's a chance that what you're given isn't enough information to determine the answer. So for this question specifically, it says, in a decimal number, a bar over 1 or more consecutive digits mean that the pattern of digits under the bar repeats without end. For example, 0.387 with the bar equals 0.387, and continued on. So that's just an example that they give you. The 2 quantities that are given are quantity A, it's 0.717, and quantity B, 0.71. All right, so what you want to do first is just do your initial assessment. Some of the questions on the GRE are designed to help you figure it out quickly without having a formula or needing to go deep into it. In this case, we may be inclined to assume that they're the same. We see a 7-1, we see a 7-1, and we know that these are going to both continue repeating each other. Now, I would like to test that theory to make sure we're being as thorough as possible. So for A, we have 0.71, 71, 71, 7. For quantity B, we have 0.71, 71, 71, 71. Now, this is where things can get tricky, right? If we had gone with our first reaction, made a split-second decision, and just said that they are equal, which is option 3, then we may not have detected that, in fact, there's a repetitive 7 in quantity A. So where these match up with 7 and 7, 1 and 1, 7 and 7, then we veer off to say 7 and 1, 1 and 7, 7 and 1. So what we've concluded from this is that these numbers, or this quantity, will be greater, meaning that A is the greater quantity. All right, question 2. If C minus D over C plus D equals 2 and D equals 1, what is the value of C? So the way that we're going to figure out this question is, let's go ahead and write it over to the side. So we have C minus D over C plus D, C plus D equals 2. And we know that D equals 1, right? It states it right in our question over here. So what we're going to do is we're going to substitute 1 wherever we see a D. So C minus 1 over C plus 1 equals 2. We're going to work to simplify. So C minus 1 equals 2 multiplied, because we're going to bring this denominator up to the right-hand side, C plus 1. All right, so then we're going to simplify further. C minus 1 equals 2C plus 2, because we're going to spread that right to the second and to the first and the second. Now we're going to simplify further. So I could bring the C over here, I could bring this C over here, whatever your preference is, wherever you're comfortable and you're most likely to do it correctly. So for me, I like to consolidate the variable on the left-hand side. So I'm going to say C minus 2C equals 2 plus 1, because I brought that 1 over, making it positive. I brought that 2 over and making it negative. So now we're going to end up with negative C equals 3. And then we're going to want to flip that, right? So essentially, this is negative 1 times C equals 3. Whoops. Make that a 3. Great. And then we're going to multiply that by negative 1. So C equals negative 3. And there's our answer. Going up here, we can see that negative 3 is an option. Okay, now for this question, it's helpful to know all of your rules of triangles and understanding how different angles correlate within and what the total amount of degrees is within a triangle. So I'm going to start by just writing up here that we have one triangle, make sure it reaches at the top, equals 180 degrees. Now, the way that I would factor this one is by figuring out a number of different angles. I would figure out this angle, which would figure out this angle, this one, put some 3 lines here to differentiate them, which will ultimately give me X. So I'm going to call this angle A, this one's going to be angle B, over here is angle C. So let's start by figuring out angle A. What I can see from this triangle, right here, connecting over here with angle A, is that we have 90 degrees plus 40 degrees plus angle A equals 180. Now, if I take 90 and 40 and I subtract it from 180, angle A equals 50 degrees. All right, so I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to erase A, and I'm going to write 50 degrees. Now, the other things that we know that will help us in this situation is that a solid line or a flat line is also 180 degrees. So I know that angle B, so we're going to put it over here, angle B equals 180 minus 50, which is going to equal 130 degrees. All right, and so we're going to erase B. This is all coming together, and we're going to put 130 right here. Perfect. All right, so now we're back to where we were. We have 2 angles and a smaller triangle. So I'm going to put 130 plus 30 plus angle C equals 180. So 180 minus 130 minus 30 equals 20. So C equals 20 degrees. Again, I'm going to go ahead and erase that. Did erase some other things with that. We'll put that third line back and we'll say 20 degrees. All right, and then, right, it's sort of a rinse and repeat type thing where we see that we have a flat line or a solid line and it's 20 degrees. So I'm going to take 180 minus 20 equals X. So then I'm just going to flip it around because we always like the variable to read first. So X equals 160 degrees. And then you would with your keypad, then just plug in 160 into the blank. Now, there may be a number of ways to do this. I would always recommend that if you can figure out the fastest way to get through your problems, that is great. But the strategy that's advised generally for the GRE is move as quickly through problems that you know the answer to, and the problems that will take a little bit longer, circle back to. So for me, this would be one that I'd come back to. I'd know that I could get through it. I know all of the steps, but maybe I'd want to make sure that I don't sacrifice any others for the time it would take. If you have a better, faster way of doing this, that is fantastic. Go with whatever makes you feel comfortable. But this is the best way that I would factor through it in my mind. Of course, I may not write out every single step like I did for you here, but the best way to learn is to teach, and the best way to teach is to understand it the best that you can yourself. So that's how and why I came about it in this way. But I'm sure there are other ways as well to figure out what this X is right here. Okay, so we've covered a variety of different types of problems and equations that we might need. And this one is a really great one because it's talking about the mean, median, mode, range, all of those that fall within that category. So for this question, it says, a quality control analyst collected 200 measurements of length. The range was of the 200 measurements is 17 centimeters. And one of the measurements is 49.5 centimeters. Which of the following could be another one of the 200 measurements in centimeters? Indicate all such measurements. So this one can be a little tricky, and I really advise you to always make sure that you're reading through the question in full. So you can see that it's asking us to indicate all of the measurements. You can also see that by the layout of the answers. It's not a bubble to be filled, it's not a blank to be filled, but rather check boxes in which you can check as many or as few as you would like. So when we look at this question, we see that we have 200 total measurements. And the range is 17 centimeters. So that means that if we were to just put this on a number line and we have this one, this one, this one, this one, and we have so many, let's just say that each one of these represents 10 because that's probably about 200, that from here all the way to here is 17 centimeters. So from the smallest one to the largest one is 17 centimeters. One of the measurements is 49.5 centimeters. So somewhere in here is 49.5 centimeters. Could be here, could be here, or could be somewhere in the middle. And it does not tell us where. Which of the following could be another one of the 200 measurements in centimeters? So what we want to do is we want to think about the greatest and the smallest measurements in which could fall within this range. So let's just say here we are at the bottom and we're starting with 49.5. The largest it could get is 17. So we're going to add 17 to that. And it's going to give us 66.5. Or we could have it all the way at the top, up here, And it could be negative 17 for the smallest. 49.5 minus 17 is 32.5. Okay, so what we're looking at essentially, I'm going to redraw this not so straight plot, is that the smallest we could get is 32.5 and the largest we could get is 66.5. So what we're looking for in this is everything within this list that falls within these 2 points of 32.5 and 66.5. So first I'm going to look at 31. 31 is smaller than 32.5, so it would fall somewhere down here below the region in which we're looking. 32, this is tricky. So you see the 32, you see the 32, and you think, I should probably check that. But if we look closer, we have 32 here, and we have 32.5. So although it's close, it falls outside of the range in which we're working. We have 33, which would fall within. So we're good to go on that one. I'm going to go ahead and check it as I go. No reason to wait until the end. Might make a mistake. And then we have 34, which would come right up here as well within the range. And we're going to check that one as well. So reviewing this question, when we think of the 200 measurements that fall within a range of 17 centimeters, and we're starting with 49.5 either at the beginning or we're ending with 49.5, the restraints of this are 32.5 and 66.5, meaning that 33 and 34 are only two measurements that fall within, so we'll be checking two. All right, well, that was our last question. I just wanted to reiterate some of the resources in which we have. We have ETS, Khan Academy, Kaplan, and Princeton Review. I would highly recommend checking these out if you haven't already. Please comment below if you have any additional resources that you think would be helpful to your peers, to your fellow GRE study students. But I really appreciate your time. I hope this helped. And I wish you luck on your exam. All right, thanks so much.